Cormac McCarthy is a master of creating depressing and disturbing scenes. His words invade the mind. They crawl in through the darkest parts of your subconscious to always somehow remind you of something similar you've experienced in your own life. But out of everything he has written, from the devil disguised as a cowboy to chilling cartel hitmen, there's one story that causes more strife in my mind than all the rest. It was one of the stories I read shortly after he passed away, which is what initially sparked my interest in his work. It is a story about isolation, moral decay, and a man's tragic descent into the deepest recesses of darkness. Every time I think of the main character's descent into madness and the disgusting act he committed, it disturbs my faith in human nature. It's far from a classic serial killer novel. It's something more realistic. While we may have clips from the movie shown on screen, this will just be about the book itself and not the film adaptation. Child of God is a novel that lingers in the back of your mind like a half-forgotten nightmare. It's a story of exile, of isolation, of a man descending into something less than human. Like McCarthy's first two novels, Child of God is a gothic horror set in Appalachia. The story follows the deterioration of 27-year-old Lester Ballard after he is violently dispossessed of his family farm and becomes a serial killer. Through Lester's extreme isolation and moral corruption, McCarthy explores the themes of fate in a world without grace, the violence inherent to humanity, the fear of societal breakdown, and the nature of free will. So, let's dive into the bleak, unforgiving world of Sevier County, Tennessee, and uncover what makes this story so chilling. Set in the desolate landscape of 1960s Tennessee, Child of God follows Lester Ballard, a violent outcast who loses his home, wanders the Appalachian wilderness, and slips further into depravity, culminating in murder, necrophilia, and complete estrangement from society. But McCarthy does more than just shock. With his stark, biblical prose and relentless examination of human nature, he forces us to look at something we'd rather turn away from. And the worst part, we can't help but recognize something of it in ourselves. So if you think you're ready, let's dive into the bleak and terrifying world of Child of God. In Sevier County, Tennessee, a crowd gathers for the auction of Lester Ballard's farm, which the state has seized. Lester is a small, unkempt man of Saxon and Celtic bloods that the narrator states may be much like the reader. The only surviving member of his family, Lester has lived on the farm his entire life. The auctioneer has arranged a band, a lemonade stand, and a giveaway of silver dollars to draw a crowd. Lester lurks nearby in the barn, where there hangs the rope that his father used to unalive himself. The auctioneer begins his pitch. The land, full of young timber, is a good investment for the future and the best in the country. As the auctioneer's voice echoes through the valley, it takes on an unearthly, ghostly quality. Lester emerges from the barn with his rifle and confronts the auctioneer. The auctioneer warns Lester that the sheriff, Fate Turner, is present, and that Lester's continued harassment will land him in a psychiatric hospital. He goads Lester to use the rifle. The scene continues in the next section, in which the narration switches from the third person to an anonymous first-person narrator. Throughout Part 1, the narration periodically switches to unnamed residents of Sevier County, who all recount stories of Lester. The anonymous narrator notes that present at the auction is the man who buys Lester's entire property, John Greer, an outsider from another part of Tennessee. While Lester is pestering the auctioneer, another man, Buster, strikes Lester on the head with the blunt side of an axe. Lester collapses, his eyes cross, and blood runs from his ears. Sheriff Turner and his deputy take Lester away, and the auction continues. Lester's injury permanently alters the way he holds his head. From the outset, McCarthy makes it clear. Ballard is a child of God, much like yourself, as the narrator tells us, a statement as unsettling as it is ambiguous. Homeless and bitter, Lester retreats into the mountains, squatting in a dilapidated cabin abandoned by its owners. Lester clears the cabin of refuse and has a dinner of a cigarette and a potato roasted over an oil lamp. While he lies down, he sees a snake above him in the rafters. Lester dislodges the snake, which slithers away, and goes to sleep thirsty. Here, the seeds of his solitude take root. The people of Sevier County shun him, and Lester, in turn, grows more feral, more detached. His interactions with the outside world grow increasingly bizarre and troubling. He spies on couples in their cars, lurking in the shadows of Frog Mountain. He drinks with the abusive dump keeper Rubel, a man whose cruelty towards his daughter shocks even Lester. And in fleeting moments with women, Lester's awkwardness and frustration reveal his complete inability to connect with others. These encounters serve as grim foreshadowing for the darkness to come. Ballard's descent begins here, not just physically as he moves from his home into the wilderness, but psychologically. This act of disposition mirrors the economic hardships of the time, as McCarthy draws from the historic reality of families losing land to unpaid taxes in rural Tennessee. The auction scene itself is a microcosm of Ballard's future, a carnival-like atmosphere of cruelty. As McCarthy writes, Lester Ballard could never hold his head right after that. This one act of violence, when Lester is struck during the auction, changes him irreparably. It foreshadows his spiral into something unrecognizable. McCarthy presents Ballard as something both familiar and alien, an echo of our own desires, fears, and impulses, stripped of civilization's constraints. After he is violently removed from his home, Ballard doesn't seek to rejoin society. Instead, he drifts deeper into the hills, into solitude, and into madness. This rejection is significant. Sevier County, Tennessee, where the novel takes place, has a long history of vigilante justice and social exclusion. McCarthy references historical accounts of Whitecap and Blue Bill violence, two vigilante factions that took it upon themselves to regulate morality in the community. This sets the stage for Ballard's own fate. He is a man seen as unworthy, as something to be discarded. He watches lovers on Frog Mountain, hiding in trees, his voyeurism just one step removed from the brutality to come. The people of Sevier County whisper about him. They tell stories. They dismiss him. And in doing so, they create a monster. But what McCarthy seems to ask is, was the monster already there? Was Ballard always on this path? or did society's rejection accelerate his descent? It's a question without an easy answer. His exile is both a cause and a consequence of his crimes, a cycle that feeds into itself. McCarthy paints a grim picture of what happens when a man is completely abandoned by the structures that define humanity. As time passes, Lester's isolation deepens, and his actions become more grotesque. At first, Ballard is just a man on the margins, scavenging, stealing, threatening, but not yet killing. But then, winter comes, and in the cold, he finds something that alters his trajectory forever. Lester, out hunting squirrels, finds a couple inexplicably dead in their car. McCarthy doesn't give us the details of how they died. Carbon monoxide? Self-delete? Murder? It doesn't matter. What matters is what Ballard does next. Lester pulls the man off the woman and is surprised by the man's still erect you-know-what. Turning off the engine and closing the car door against the cold, Lester has some close relations with the woman's corpse. Quote, pouring into that waxen ear everything he'd ever thought of saying to that woman. Lester leaves with the woman's underwear, only to sprint back to search the car for valuables. He steals their money, the woman's makeup, and a pint of whiskey. Again, he departs, before returning again for the woman's corpse. As he returns up the road this final time, a hawk wheels overhead. Lester lugs the corpse to his cabin. He builds a fire, undresses the corpse, and climbs into bed next to it. Later that afternoon, two men to whom Mr. Waldrop has given permission to hunt on his property appear unexpectedly, worried that they'll see the corpse. Lester scares them away. He cleans a spot in the loft and, using a rope and a ladder, hauls up the corpse. Lifted by the rope, the corpse appears reanimated. Lester makes a squirrel stew, then hides the ladder and walks 3 hours into Sevierville. At a clothing store attended by a woman, Lester stumbles his way through the purchase of a red dress and set of lingerie. Then, he goes to buy food. The owner of the general store, Mr. Fox, mentions that it's forecast to drop to 3 degrees that night, and that a dead man was found at the lookout. In response to this, back at his cabin, Lester builds a massive fire against the cold, and brings the woman's corpse down from the loft to defrost. When she does, he applies her makeup, dresses her in the red dress and lingerie, and poses her in different ways. He goes outside to look in the window at each of these poses. Talking to the corpse, he slowly undresses it again and has some more very close relations with it. After returning it to the loft, Lester stuffs the fireplace with wood up into the chimney and dares the night to freeze. It has dropped below 0 when Lester awakes to a room full of smoke. The loft has caught fire. Cursing, Lester ferries his rifle and his other possessions outside before returning for the corpse. The fire in the loft is too hot, so Lester abandons the corpse and returns outside with only his stuffed animals. In awe, he watches as flames engulf the cabin. Before morning, the fire burns to embers, and Lester wakes to the cold. He builds a nest of weeds by the still warm hearth and makes coffee. Although he often talks to himself, he doesn't say anything now. When the sun rises, Lester searches through the ashes. He finds no trace of the woman. Lester moves his possessions up a mountain to a cave. There, the remains of a long-dead fire lay under a skylight in the rock. Using embers from the cabin, Lester starts his own fire. In the moment he drug the woman's body back to the cabin, the last shreds of his humanity slipped away. He talks to her, dresses her, positions her like a doll. He's no longer just an outcast. He's something much darker. In an act that shocks and horrifies, Lester violates the woman's body. This act is not just disturbing. It marks the moment Lester crosses a boundary, fully severing himself from societal norms. What's striking is how McCarthy presents this scene with spark, unflinching prose, forcing readers to confront the raw, primal impulses that Lester embodies. McCarthy's description of this moment is haunting in its detachment. Ballard's actions are grotesque, but the sadness beneath them is undeniable. He craves connection, but he's incapable of achieving it in any normal way. Then, the cabin burns down, and with it, the corpse vanishes. This is a turning point. With nothing left, not a home, not even his grotesque semblance of a companion, Ballard moves into a cave. Quite literally, he regresses. He becomes more animal than man, and soon, finding bodies is no longer enough. He begins to make them. From here, Lester's descent accelerates living in the cave. He begins to steal, murder, and collect the bodies of his victims, hiding them in a cave deep in the mountains. These corpses become his twisted companions, a surrogate for the connections he is incapable of forming with the living. Dressed in their clothes, he watches the world from afar, a grotesque mimicry of a life he can't have. The cave becomes both a sanctuary and a tomb, symbolizing Lester's complete withdrawal from humanity. Violence is always inherent in McCarthy's worlds. It's in the history of Sevier County, in the legacy of vigilantism, in the blood-soaked earth itself. Ballard's murders don't feel like aberrations. They feel like inevitabilities. The sheriff even expects them, but the town dismisses them. The mountains contain them. Something monstrous. And yet, there are moments of eerie normalcy. Ballard shops for food. He interacts with townspeople, albeit awkwardly. He struggles to light a fire in the cold. These brief glimpses of normality make his descent all the more horrifying. He is not some mythic monster. He is a man, and that makes all the difference. Yet McCarthy's genius lies in the ability to evoke not just horror, but also pity. Through fragmented narratives, we glimpse the brokenness that defines Lester's life. His crimes are abhorrent, but they stem from profound loneliness, rejection, and a world that has consistently failed him. The novel forces us to grapple with uncomfortable questions. Is Lester born a monster, or does society's rejection make him one? In his isolation, Lester reflects the novel's central themes, the violence inherent in humanity, and the fragility of societal order. It's a chilling reminder of how thin the veneer of civilization truly is. In his cave, Lester has arranged his stuffed animals on his mattress against the wall. Leaving his main room, Lester deftly navigates deeper into the cave system. Water drips and flows everywhere, distorting the light of his lamp, as if bent back by some strange underground force. A narrow, mile-long watercourse debouches into a vaulted cavern with muddy, blood-red walls. Throughout the cave, he had set up the corpses he had collected onto stone ledges, posed and prodded for his own amusement. Let's dive into his true first killing, which McCarthy adds more detail for. His trajectory towards his nadir continues with his murder of a local's daughter. This murder is significant because it is the first he commits in service of the grotesque fulfillment of his sexual urges and longing for companionship. Lester also commits this murder and the subsequent arson out of spite and revenge, having just lost his cabin to a fire of his own making, a fire he blames on his perceived persecution by the universe. Lester enacts what he sees as a cosmic, karmic retribution, burning down someone else's home. As for the murder, he commits it partly out of spite. He resents what that girl said to him. Quote, "You ain't even a man. You're just a crazy thing." Unquote. And he wants to prove himself. His response, quote, "I might be more than you think." Unquote. However, by murdering her, Lester proves her right. He is cowardly and psychopathic, not a man at all. However, McCarthy hints this doesn't just mean that Lester is inhuman, one meaning of the girl's insult, or crazy. His actions are evidence not of something alien, but the violence inherent to humanity. McCarthy also uses the setting to illustrate Lester's devolution and hint at an almost supernatural violence native to Sevier County. Lester's move from the cabin to the cave marks a regression to a primitive way of being. In taking Lester farther away from human civilization, the move furthers his alienation from the civilized mind. The isolated, Paleolithic environment conduces to animalistic interpretations of the world. The novel moves with an eerie, quiet momentum toward its inevitable conclusion. Ballard's killings become more frequent. His isolation becomes total. And yet, there are moments, fleeting, tragic moments, where he seems to grasp at something more. One of the most poignant scenes comes near the end, as Ballard watches the valley below him. It's spring, and the world is being reborn. Quote, "He hangs his head and cries." Unquote. For a moment, it seems as though he feels the weight of his actions, the impossibility of returning to the world he's left behind. But it is just a moment. The world moves on, indifferent to his suffering. In the final pages, he escapes a group of vigilantes and spends days lost in the cave system, reduced to nothing but an animal clinging to life. When he finally emerges, he's unrecognizable. He knows not what to do besides walk to a psychiatric hospital where he dies of pneumonia. His body, in the end, dissected by doctors. Lester's commitment to the psychiatric hospital reveals the auctioneer's warning to Lester in the first chapter, that if, quote, "you don't get a grip on yourself, they're gonna put you in a rubber room," unquote. Partly driven there by others, and partly driven there by his own actions, Lester's fate is a result of human, not divine, factors. The most telling part of this denouncement is that Lester voluntarily returns himself to the psychiatric hospital after escaping death in the caves. His vision of his corpse overtaken by the cave's vermin and insects makes him realize he'd rather face the punishment of his fellow men than suffer a meaningless death surrounded by nothing but earth and insects, since the psychiatric hospital is the only place in society that is open to him. As he says, quote, "I'm supposed to be here," unquote. So that's where Lester goes. His voluntary return to the hospital is a self-fulfillment of the auctioneer's prophecy. The climax comes in the pair of chapters in which Lester, realizing the true nature of his circumstances, attacks John Greer, the man he scapegoats for his misfortune, and the man who bought his family farm. Despite his perverted attempts to build a family with his stuffed animals and his harem of corpses, Lester remains utterly alone in the world. He realizes this as he watches spring unfold in the valley. Quote, "He watched the diminutive progress of all things in the valley, the gray fields coming up black and corded under the plow, the slow green occlusion that the trees were spreading. This cathartic experience coming in spring is symbolic. In the midst of renewal, Lester reaches his climax. The overturning of the dead, gray topsoil to reveal the black, nutrient-rich earth underneath symbolizes perennial renewal. As the occlusion of leaves hints, Lester is barred from this renewal, from life, from the country he once inhabited. Far away from humanity, he sits on the mountain in a cold wind, surrounded only by sparse high mountains, bracken, and brittle gray ferns. Witnessing the renewal of life below while imprisoned in his desolation, a desolation mirrored by his barren surroundings, Lester weeps. Eventually, the sinkhole is discovered. 7 bodies, bound in muslin, are drawn out of the earth and carried down the mountain. The secret made visible, the uncanny made real. Ballard's final moments in the cave system, his desperate attempts to cling to life, offer a haunting parallel to the beginning of the novel. He starts as a man stripped of everything, wandering the hills, and he ends the same way, only this time he is something else entirely, his transformation complete. We often forget that our humanity is the most valuable thing to us, and no matter what happens, we can always make the decision to maintain it. But even in death, Lester's legacy lingers. The discovery of his hidden bodies shocks the county, exposing the depths of his depravity. McCarthy leaves us with the haunting image of mold-covered corpses pulled from the earth, their forms twisted but disturbingly human. It's a reminder that even in the most grotesque acts, there remains an echo of humanity, a truth that's both disturbing and profound. While all of this was happening, McCarthy was bringing in heavy biblical implications. Sevierville was being flooded. Not just any flood, but a biblical flood. The flood of Sevierville resounds with the connotation of biblical punishment. The allusion to the biblical flood in Genesis becomes explicit in the scene of Sheriff Turner, Deputy Cotton, and Mr. Wade traveling by boat through the town. The sheriff makes a joke about looking out for Noah's Ark, and Mr. Wade relays the sentiment of another resident that the flood is divine punishment. In Genesis 6, God, seeing that the world is corrupt with violence, decides to wash away this corruption and start anew. Sevier County before the flood resembles the world of the Bible in that it, too, is filled with moral corruption and violence. The flood doesn't just punish Lester, driving him out of the cave and ripping away half of his pseudo-family, the teddy bears. It also seems to punish the other residents of the county. When juxtaposed with his telling of the violent history of vigilantism in the county, and the presence of all the residents at a cruel and unusual hanging, Mr. Wade's remarked that, quote, "Everybody in Sevier County would have to be rotten to the core to warrant this," unquote. This raises the idea that the residents are in some way complicit with the meanness that prevails there. As McCarthy suggests, violence and cruelty are inherent to humanity. To the people of Sevier County, all of them cultural, if not devout Christians, the flood prompts a reflection on what place unjust violence has in their land. Let's take a look at some of the common themes discussed in this book. Cormac McCarthy's Child of God is more than a novel of violence and exile. It's a meditation on the dark corners of human nature, society's role in shaping outcasts, and the inescapable cycle of violence. While our previous discussion explored the novel's themes of isolation and brutality, we're now going to go a little bit deeper. We'll examine the real-world historical and cultural influences that shape the novel, analyze the complex psychology of its characters, and break down the novel's symbols and motifs that underscore its deeper meaning. This is not just a novel, but a reflection of the world that created it. We need to talk about the cultural background of serial killers. Published in 1973, Child of God arrived at a time when serial killers had captured the public imagination. The 1960s saw a string of lurid crimes that shook the nation: the Boston Strangler's reign of terror from 1962 to 1964, Richard Speck's murder of 8 student nurses in 1966, and, most infamously, the Tate LaBianca murders orchestrated by Charles Manson in 1969. These crimes forced Americans to reckon with the horrifying reality that some individuals, completely alienated from society, could commit unspeakable acts. A lesser-known crime that likely influenced McCarthy was the 1963 Lula Lake murders in Chattanooga, Tennessee. A teenage couple, Orville Steele and Caroline Newell, disappeared from a well-known lover's lane, only to be discovered murdered days later. James Blevins, a known peeping Tom, was convicted of the murders, though later acquitted. Much like Blevins, Lester Ballard is a voyeur who prowls remote areas, lurking on the margins of civilization. McCarthy does not simply use these crimes for shock value. He explores how isolation and social rejection can fuel violence. We see that often in today's media around school shootings, where perpetrators are often known as the weird kids who are left on the fringes of social circles. We should also take a look at the historical context of vigilantism in Sevier County. Sevier County, Tennessee, where Child of God is set, has a long history of vigilante justice. McCarthy references the real-life conflicts between two vigilante factions, the Whitecaps and the Blue Bills, in the late 19th century. The Whitecaps were a secretive, hooded group that sought to enforce morality through violent public punishments, while the Blue Bills emerged as a resistance force, leading to violent confrontations. McCarthy mirrors this history in the novel, when a gang of men abducts Ballard, attempting to force a confession out of him. Their actions parallel those of the vigilante groups that once ruled Sevier County. But in true McCarthy fashion, justice is far from clear-cut. Just as the Whitecaps' efforts to enforce morality turned into brutal acts of violence, the vigilantes in Child of God only fuel further destruction. Even Sheriff Fate Turner, the enforcer of law, is revealed to be just another cog in the machine of institutionalized violence. Now let's take a look at Lester himself, a truly lost man. Lester Ballard is a deeply fractured character, a man both victim and predator, outcast and monster. His childhood trauma shapes much of his psychology. His father's self-deletion left him orphaned at the age of 9, setting him on a path of detachment from the world. Ballard lacks a coherent sense of self. As one character notes, he only speaks in borrowed phrases, echoing things he's heard others say. Quote, "All the trouble I was ever in was caused by whiskey or women or both." He'd often hear men say as much. Unquote. Unlike other characters who can express their thoughts freely, Ballard's language is hollow. This suggests an arrested development, an inability to form an identity beyond the instincts that drive him. McCarthy repeatedly dehumanizes Ballard through animalistic imagery. When he is chased away from a lover's lane, he scuttles, quote, like a misplaced and loveless simian shape, unquote. Later, after losing his home, he takes to the wilderness like a wounded animal. His transformation is complete when he moves into his cave, mirroring the regression from civilization to a primal state. This leads us to the theme of inherent violence. McCarthy does not present violence as a temporary lapse. It is an external force, embedded in human nature. Sheriff Turner embodies this idea, believing some men are simply beyond redemption. Quote, "Some people you ain't do nothing with," unquote. Even the legal system, which should stand in opposition to violence, is itself drenched in brutality. When two real-life Whitecap members are executed in McCarthy's historical retelling, their death is drawn out and painful, underscoring the idea that state-sanctioned violence is no different from mob justice. Ballard's own crimes, horrifying as they are not unique. The novel repeatedly suggests that Sevier County has always been a violent place, that Ballard is simply another character in its dark history. The discovery of the bodies in the sinkhole at the novel's end reinforces this point. Ballard is gone, but the violence remains. The uncanny is certainly a symbol within the book. It's no secret that the novel is steeped in Freud's concept of the uncanny, when the familiar becomes deeply unsettling. Ballard treats corpses as living companions, dressing them and speaking to them. This blurring of life and death is deeply disturbing, reinforcing the novel's atmosphere of horror. There's also the symbol of birds. McCarthy frequently uses hawks and nightjars as symbols of fate and predation. When Ballard first decides to steal a corpse, a hawk circles overhead, mirroring his descent into darkness. Later, his isolation becomes absolute. He watches mating hawks and interprets their movements as a sign that everything in life is a fight, Hunting dogs are also prevalent in the book. In Sevier County, hunting dogs represent power and control. Lester, who's an outcast, does not have the means to train or own them. He resents their presence, seeing them as a symbol of the world that has shut him out. Child of God is more than a grotesque tale of murder. It's a meditation of history, fate, and human nature. McCarthy suggests that violence is not an anomaly, but an intrinsic part of civilization, resurfacing in different forms throughout history. Lester Ballard is a product of his world, but he is also a warning, a reflection of what happens when someone is cast out, pushed to the fringes, and left to fester. There's so much to unpack in Child of God. It's a novel about the monstrous, not just in Lester Ballard, but in the world around him. Through its stark, unrelenting depiction of Lester's life, McCarthy challenges us to examine our own moral boundaries. What does it mean to be human? How much of our identity is shaped by those around us? And what happens when those connections are severed? These are questions that linger long after the final page. McCarthy's presentation is as unflinching as his subject matter. He spares no detail in describing Lester's descent. Yet there's a lyrical quality to his writing that captures the brutal beauty of the Appalachian landscape. The mountains, rivers, and forests are as much a part of the story as Lester himself, their harshness mirroring his own struggles. The novel's structure, shifting between third-person narration and the voices of townsfolk, creates a tapestry of perspectives that deepens our understanding of Lester's world. Child of God is one of McCarthy's bleakest, most disturbing works. It forces us to confront what we'd rather ignore: the fragility of civilization, the thin line between man and monster, the way isolation and rejection breed violence. Lester Ballard is an outcast, yes, a murderer, certainly, but McCarthy's terrifying implication is that he is also something else, a reflection. So the question remains, if he is a child of God, much like ourselves, what does that make us? McCarthy does not offer easy answers. Instead, he leaves us in discomfort, with ambiguity, with a sense of unease that lingers long after the book is closed. But what do you think? Is Lester a victim of his circumstances, or does he embody the violence within all of us? Can we ever truly separate ourselves from the darkness that lies beneath the surface? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, thank you for watching. Stay curious, and keep exploring the darker sides of literature. See you next time.